You might have seen I made a video earlier this year about what I considered to be the sports that had some of the fittest athletes in the world. In that video I included rugby, CrossFit, gymnastics, decathlon and MMA. And I picked MMA for the top spot, but it was pretty close. There was a lot of debate in the comments, which I like to see. Lots of good discussions about which was the hardest, people sharing their personal experiences and some other ideas for different sports that could be included. So I'm making a part 2 to highlight some of these other sports and see if the rankings should change at all. My definition of fitness for the last video wasn't very clear, so for this video I am talking about physical well-roundedness. Basically how much the sport incorporates the different aspects of fitness like strength, endurance, power, speed, all of those separate components of fitness together into one physical specimen. Something like powerlifting is obviously very high on the strength scale, but there's not much endurance there at all. But then something like football has a lot of endurance, speed, explosiveness and so on. It's more of a mixed bag of physical attributes. So really I'm talking about the most well-rounded athletes, which is why last time I put MMA, rugby and CrossFit so high in that video, because all of those sports require pretty much all aspects of fitness to be very well developed. Maybe in the future I can make other videos for things like the strongest sports, the best endurance, the most explosive and so on. But let's think about some of the other candidates for the most well-rounded sport in the world. A lot of guys on the last video were commenting saying that out of the fighting sports, wrestling specifically was the most challenging in terms of fitness, even compared to other hard sports like rugby and football and cross country. And I think they have a point too. Obviously wrestlers are crazy strong, picking people up and tossing them around and struggling against another man's full strength. I know it's an extreme example, but take a look at Alexander Karelin or some of the modern wrestlers from the Caucasus Mountains or the collegiate wrestlers in America to see the physical specimens that this sport produces. Really impressive explosiveness and agility too, obviously, plus the endurance to last several rounds. So this is definitely a contender, I think, for the top spot. If we compare them to something like CrossFit, which is designed to develop all aspects of fitness, they'd probably be pretty close to equal with them. Maybe their endurance isn't quite as good, but I doubt there would be much in it. Another martial art that got a lot of discussion was Muay Thai, which is understandable. These guys are known for their insane conditioning and training routines with hours of technique drilling and bag work and sparring very often. Some champions like Buakaw come to mind as just being insane physical specimens. I've never done Muay Thai myself, but I have done boxing, and even that is pretty exhausting and you're not even using your legs, so you have to be very fit to be a good Muay Thai fighter. I don't think their strength would be super high, certainly not on the level of wrestlers, because they're not fully picking people up and throwing them around. Obviously they do still have clinches and sweeps and stuff, but it's not quite on that level. Another one that a lot of people mentioned was water polo, which apparently is one of the hardest sports, which I guess makes sense with all the extra resistance that's provided by the water, and it can also get pretty rough from what I hear. You definitely need strength to move yourself through the water, obviously a lot of endurance to last all 4 quarters, which are often over 10 minutes long, with pretty constant action. Obviously also explosiveness, coordination, reaction times and so on. It's quite an underrated sport, I think. They wouldn't have the strength levels of a rugby player or a wrestler, but you could certainly make an argument for water polo being one of the fittest sports, and a lot of people have made that argument. Football or soccer is obviously also up there. You're running around almost non-stop for 90 minutes at a pretty fast pace. I believe the studies have been done and these guys are operating at close to their anaerobic threshold for the whole game. Loads of sprinting, you need really good agility obviously, with sharp turns, there's some jumping, and they run something like 7 miles in a 90-minute game. So there's a lot of endurance, there's a lot of speed. It's a pretty well-rounded sport. Again, not so much on the strength side. A wrestler is going to squat more than a football player, for example, but a wrestler probably couldn't run around a pitch, at the same pace that a football player could. So they're slightly different specialties in terms of fitness. And it did amuse me to see in the comments how some people were absolutely certain, no doubt in their mind, that football was the fittest sport or that boxing was the fittest sport, and there's no question about it. So clearly there should be some debates going on about this, because there are some people who are just certain that one sport is the fittest, and I'd like to see them come together and make their arguments as to why their sport is harder or more impressive than someone else's sport. I'll mention a few longer duration endurance sports now. So rowers, I knew a few rowers at university and they were definitely very fit. You don't often see athletes in many other sports like throwing up after a race or a match, but this happens quite often in rowing. It's like 7+ minutes of excruciating effort for like a 2,000 meter, which requires insane cardio and muscular endurance and mental strength as well. Rowers are pretty impressive specimens. Cycling is another one. So cycling as a sport has some of the highest VO2 maxes ever recorded. In fact, the world record for the highest VO2 max ever recorded was from a road cyclist. And among those top spots for VO2 max, you have people who are like road cyclists and also shorter distance track cycling events like Team Pursuit. These are guys with like 80 or 90 plus VO2 max, when, you know, a very impressive one would be like above 60. So both of those kinds of cycling, shorter distance and very long distance, can be found in like the top 10 highest VO2 maxes ever recorded. Road cyclists are certainly not going to be very strong in terms of how much weight they can lift, but it's a different story for track cyclists who do like sprint events, because they have to output like a lot of force in a very short period of time. So you can take a look at Robert Förstermann, who's a German sprint cyclist, also known as Quadzilla, who can Bulgarian split squat 200 kilograms for reps. That's on one leg. Another one that I hadn't ever really heard of until people mentioned it in the comments was cross-country skiing. And from watching a few clips, it looks absolutely exhausting, especially for like your arms, your shoulders, and your back. And these athletes, along with cyclists, have some of the highest VO2 maxes ever recorded. It's like cycling and cross-country skiing, and there's some endurance runners are up there with like the highest VO2 maxes. So these guys have amazing endurance, and they're probably pretty strong, but not quite up there with some of the other more strength-focused sports like wrestling. Generally in sports where the athletes have a really high VO2 max, their strength isn't going to be quite as high. So you can be very strong and have very good cardio, but one person is never going to have 10 out of 10 in both at the same time. 7 or 8 out of 10 in both at the same time, sure, maybe even 9 out of 10. And those are the athletes that I would consider most physically capable, most well-rounded. Those are like your CrossFit athletes or your martial artists, for example. The ones who are very good in multiple areas, but, you know, not maxed out in any one area. And like I mentioned, endurance runners are another one in this category of endurance sports. I think this is the one that comes to most non-active people's minds when they think of fit athletes or like the world's fittest people. They probably think like marathon runners or ultra marathons, right? And there are some of these guys in the top VO2 max scores as well. Obviously, they won't be very strong at all in most cases, but their bodies have been honed to convert glucose and oxygen into energy as efficiently as physically possible. That's their specialty, like the most incredible aerobic endurance and efficiency. But again, not super well-rounded. Unbelievable cardiovascular system and muscular endurance, but, you know, an ultra-marathon runner, I don't think they would do so well in a CrossFit or a high rocks competition, for example, compared to, you know, someone who trained to be slightly more well-rounded in their attributes with like strength and agility and explosiveness and stuff. American football kind of has to be mentioned. So some of these guys can move at speeds that really shouldn't be possible for men their size, like 300-pound offensive linemen running sub 5-second 40-yard dashes. And obviously they're freakishly strong too. And then some of the smaller guys are even faster and have a vertical jump of like 35+ inches. Just unreal athleticism from some of these like NFL athletes. And by smaller guys, I mean like 200 pounds or 90 kilos. So they're not small at all. NFL players really are physical specimens. And like I did say in the last video, their endurance doesn't really get particularly tested that much. There's so much stopping and starting and short plays in American football that even positions like wide receiver only run an average of like 2 kilometers per game, or barely over 1 mile in total. But that is generally a very high intensity, like sprinting. So it's very much a high intensity interval kind of sport. But I do have to acknowledge that they do a lot of intervals, like there are a lot of plays in one game. So there definitely is an endurance component, but it's not like continuous endurance. It is lots and lots of intervals. Another one that people mentioned was swimming. Obviously there are a lot of different types of swimming, and people are usually quite specialized in one or a few strokes or distances. And for this reason, it's pretty hard to say that swimmers are well-rounded, because a sprint swimmer wouldn't do very well in like a long distance open water swim, for example. But you can make the same argument for a lot of these sports where there are different events and different positions. But I don't think anyone would dispute that people like Michael Phelps or Caleb Dressel or Adam Peaty are incredible athletes. And you do have to be pretty strong, at least as a quite short distance swimmer, but maybe they wouldn't have the same endurance as, you know, a long distance runner or a cyclist or something. Tennis players also have unbelievable endurance. These matches last for hours and sometimes they even spill over into the next day. But even more than that, it seems like quite a high intensity, like speed focused sport. You know, you have to have crazy reaction times. You have to move so quickly across the court. You need a lot of agility to like quickly make turns. You need to be accurate. A lot of power to hit the ball sufficiently hard. Tennis players are definitely very impressive athletes, although their strength, again, probably isn't quite as high as some of the other sports. A couple people also mentioned climbing. In terms of body weight strength ratios, climbers are really impressive. Some of the most insane strength and endurance in their forearms and their pulling muscles that I've ever seen, and pretty explosive too for those holds where you have to like jump to reach them. And I really like the culture of climbing as well. It's a very wholesome environment. But I don't think climbers would win in a competition that tested like all-round physical ability, something like a CrossFit competition. They're a bit more specialized, so not so much cardiovascular endurance going on in climbing, more like muscular endurance and kind of strength. And even though they tend to be quite light body weight, these guys are really strong. You might have seen the video with like Larry Wheels and a climber, and the climber is pretty much matching what Larry Wheels is doing on some of these machines in the gym. Just really, really like dense muscles, very high motor unit recruitment. You know, they have a lot of control over the muscle that they do have in their body, and they're able to output so much force, even if they're not the biggest athletes. And the last one I wanted to mention was ice hockey. One commenter said that he spoke to a kinesiologist that worked with Olympic athletes, and the best all-round, most conditioned athletes were actually the ice hockey players. And another commenter on the last video said there's nothing as draining and demanding as hockey, with its repeated acceleration from a standstill, like stopping, re-accelerating constantly over and over, all while carrying 30 pounds of gear. I don't have any experience with ice hockey, so I can't really comment, but it's a pretty rough game. Lots of collisions, you know, rapid changes in direction, accuracy. There's an aspect of balance as well, being on the ice skates, that you don't have in many other sports, and these guys are pretty strong too. So to be honest, I definitely see that argument here for them being the most well-rounded athletes. They've got the strength, endurance, speed, power, accuracy, balance. Very impressive athletes. So I've highlighted a lot more sports than the last video, but how would I rank these in order? This is definitely going to be controversial. Can't wait to see the comments. And I'll bring in the sports from the other video as well. Right, let's see if I can rank these in a sensible order. This is going to be quite hard because they're all obviously very impressive, but I have to keep reminding myself I'm ranking them by how well-rounded they are. How well they incorporate like strength and endurance and speed and all of those attributes. I'll start like at the bottom, the ones I think are not quite so well rounded. So I'm going to put endurance cycling on there, like road cycling, because there's much more of a focus on endurance, a bit less strength. I'm sure they're pretty strong, but again, you know, not quite so well rounded as some of these other sports. Climbing also not so much of a cardiovascular component, so more on the strength and strength endurance side. I am tempted to put it up in pretty well rounded, but for now I'll keep it there. Endurance running, again, not enough of a focus on strength. Gymnastics, the events are pretty short, to be honest, so there's not that much of an endurance component. I'll put it in either A or B, but I haven't decided yet. Swimming is one of those ones where it could be across multiple categories, because you could have someone who's more well-rounded if they do like multiple distances, or someone who's very specialized at just like sprinting or just long distance. So I'll put it in pretty well-rounded for now. Cross-country skiing, I'm also going to put in pretty well-rounded, because there is a bit of a strength component, but it is mostly an endurance sport. Track cycling, I'll put in pretty well-rounded, I think, because I mean, like I mentioned earlier in the video, if you've got strength, but there's also a bit of an endurance component to your sport, you're probably fairly well-rounded. Like a lot of these sports that have at least some strength component that has to be continued over time, they're going to be reasonably well-rounded, and they probably won't do too badly in more endurance-focused stuff. Whereas someone who's like just a pure endurance runner, for example, not going to do very well on the strength side of things. So gymnastics, I think I'm going to put it in pretty well-rounded for now. They're obviously very, very strong, very explosive, flexible, but could I see them, beating like a CrossFit athlete or a martial artist in a test of like all-round physical ability, including like endurance? I don't think so. Now, rugby, again, in the last video I put it very highly. I'm going to stick with that in this video because they've got strength, they've got endurance, speed, all of that stuff. It's a very well-rounded sport. NFL, I think I'm going to put it in a pretty well-rounded, because there is a bit of an endurance component because they do have to last, the whole game, but there's a lot of stopping and starting. They're obviously very strong, very fast, extremely athletic, not quite so much endurance, but, I'm sure they are very good at endurance stuff, but probably not on the same level as like rugby, for example. Definitely not on the same level of endurance as like a football player. So with the football players, I'm going to put them in S or A tier. Again, I don't think they have quite the strength. Obviously, they don't have quite the strength of a rugby player, but the endurance is going to be similar. So I think they have to be below rugby, in my opinion. Rowing has a strength and an endurance component. I think they're very well rounded, so I'm going to put them in S tier. Ice hockey, also strength and endurance component, very fast, lots of sharp turns. So I think they are in the discussion for a very well-rounded sport. Decathlon, like the whole point of the sport is to be extremely well-rounded in 10 events, so they have to be in S tier. CrossFit, same thing. The whole point of the sport is to develop all aspects of fitness. So this is kind of the standard that all of these other ones that have to be compared against. And we can ask ourselves, like, would a decathlete be able to beat a CrossFit athlete in a CrossFit competition, for example, where, there's not quite so much of a skill component outside of the gymnastics and the Olympic weightlifting? Do they have the physical capability to beat a CrossFit athlete in this sport? With all these other sports, like, there's a skill component, so the CrossFit athletes probably wouldn't do so well. But in a sport that is just testing physical ability, like CrossFit, that's where I think the differences between these sports are going to be revealed. Like an endurance runner just wouldn't do so well in a CrossFit competition. An NFL player would do much better, but maybe they would struggle on the endurance side of things. And then like a rower, a rugby player, these guys would do, I think, better in this kind of all-round test of fitness. MMA, that's what I put at the top of the last video. It's going to stay in this S tier also, because you have to be snappy, you have to be able to endure, you have to be strong. It requires all-round physical ability. Muay Thai is similar. Maybe the strength, isn't quite so high as an MMA athlete, but they're certainly pretty strong. They have incredible conditioning. So I think they're going to go in S tier or maybe high A tier. Tennis, very well-rounded, very good endurance, very quick, excellent reaction times, powerful. Maybe the strength not quite so high. I'll probably put them, they'd be in like high A tier, I think. Water polo, I think they've got all of the tools. They've got strength, endurance, like explosiveness, all of that stuff. And wrestling, similarly, I think has to be in the top somewhere in this S tier. I won't rank each of these one by one because that would just be incredibly difficult, but I can fairly confidently put them into these kind of tiers and say like a rugby player is more well-rounded than a road cyclist, for example. And then, there's going to be some kind of overlap between these tiers, like some blending in between tiers, but I'm pretty happy with this ranking. Go ahead and flame me in the comments for how I'm just wrong about everything. Let me know what you think this ranking should be. I'll leave the tier list in the description as well, so you can rank this yourself if you want. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this fun little video. Let me know in the comments what you think. I'm sure there will be plenty of debate, and I'll see you in the next video.